After reading the statements, we first off get two pairs. Statement B, which says the United States may be consumed by the war on terror, but development is Asia's daily fight, comes first, because this is talking about the United States and the war on terror. This is not repeated elsewhere. All other statements are related to the tragedy or the crisis, which is introduced in A as the tsunami. And then we see here, but development is Asia's daily fight. And development is then continued. The argument of development is continued in places that cannot just rebuild and rebound. So we find that there is a pair between B and A. And because the other statements all talk about the tragedy or the crisis or refer to the crisis, the tsunami in A should come before them, which means that BA is a pair and BA are the first two statements of our sequence. So we put in B as the first statement and A as the second statement. Now C is a major floater. C tells us, in local media, the tragedy is being reported entirely through this lens. So we'll come to this at the end. We find another pair in E and D. E says, will the demands of relief and recovery overwhelm governments? Will a public health crisis erupt? Can the hundreds of thousands of homeless rebuild? And then we have these questions reiterated in D. In other words, how does this crisis affect the effort to move people out of poverty and disease, which is the ever-present task of most governments in the region? So we find that the questions at one could call it a micro level. How does this crisis affect the people of these nations, of the Asian nations? How are they affected? Will the demands of relief and recovery overwhelm governments? Will there be a public health crisis? Can the hundreds of thousands of homeless rebuild? In other words, or in a simplification, how does this crisis affect the effort to move people out of poverty and disease, which is the ever-present task of most governments in the region? So after BA, we find that E and D form a pair in that order exactly. Now, once we placed E and D together, then comes the task of placing C. Looking at C now, we realize that C is talking about in local media, the tragedy is being reported entirely through this lens. Now, this lens can be referring to both BA or ED. So we cannot have C before BA because it is referring to the tragedy, and the tragedy is clearly referring to the tsunami. We can have C in two positions. It could be here, or it could be here at the end of the sequence. Now, considering this is where the problem of this or the difficulty of this question lies, considering just C and its connection with ED, we find that both of these sequences are quite all right. We can have D leading into C, where D says, in other words, how does this crisis affect the effort to move people out of poverty and disease, which is the ever-present task of most governments in the region? In local media, the tragedy is being reported entirely through this lens, which is a decent connection. While this is talking about the governments of the region, that is not how the tragedy is being reported. The tragedy is being reported entirely through this lens. This lens could be referring to how does this crisis affect the effort to move people out of poverty and disease. But this has a stronger connection with A, because A says the tsunami hits it at this very basic level, nature striking in places that cannot just rebuild and rebound. So in the local media, the tragedy is being reported entirely through this lens means that it is talking about nature striking at places that do not have the luxury of just being able to rebuild and coming out of the crisis. There are other issues at play here. We see that while D and C connect, A and E would cause a problem because A, E are somewhat contradictory. We find it here. Nature striking places that cannot just rebuild and rebound. And then in E, immediately, if C is placed here at the end, then we get the sequence as BAEDC. After A, which says places that cannot just rebuild and rebound, we immediately have E asking these questions at the end. It says, can the hundreds of thousands of homeless rebuild? Places that cannot just rebuild and rebound. That is somewhat contradictory to this particular aspect. So we find that this doesn't quite work out. The stronger connection is between A, C, and E, as in C being placed between BA and ED. And this makes perfect sense. We read A, which says the tsunami hits it at this very basic level, nature striking in places that cannot just rebuild and rebound. Then C tells us in local media, the tragedy is being reported entirely through this lens. And how is it being reported? That is presented in E with the questions. Will the demand of relief and recovery overwhelm governments? Will there be a public health crisis? Can the homeless rebuild? And so on. So we find that while C can actually be placed in both these places, it is AE that gives us the sequence. There's an abrupt jump between A and E. A and E are almost, to an extent, a very slight extent, but to an extent they are contradictory. So C acts as the perfect bridge statement in between them, which means that while C can fit at the end, we have a better choice of placing, or we'll have a better sequence or a more logical, appropriate sequence, placing C in the middle, because otherwise A and E, just the pairing of A and E seems a little illogical. So C is a much better fit here than at the end. So by comparison, we can place C here in the middle. Thus, we can eliminate this possibility that C is at the end, which means we have the sequence ready. So C comes after B and A. Then comes the pair ED. So E becomes the fourth statement in our sequence, and D becomes the fifth and final statement in our sequence. And thus we get the answer as BACED.